Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this episode of The Federal. My name is Naved Anjum, and I am joined today by Gita Krishnankutty, well known translator of novels and short stories by eminent Malayalam writers, including MT Vasudevan Nair, Lalithambika Anterjanam, Paul Zacharia, Anand, and many others. She is joining us from Chennai, and I am in Delhi. We'll be talking about this new book that she has translated of MT Vasudevan Nair. It's called Bear With Me, Amma. It is a selection of his memoirs and stories. Um, Geeta, welcome to this episode of the Federal.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much for joining.
Thank you.
So let's begin with the book. Of course, it has come out in a year when Mr. Nair has turned 90, and
Yes.
it's an important book in the sense that it gives you a sample of of his memoir, of the kind of life he has lived and how it has informed his literature, the kind of literature he has written. So if you
Yes.
could talk about this has been selected, of course, by him, but if you could talk a little bit about how this book came about, what was the idea behind bringing this volume of memoirs as well as stories.
Yes. Actually, it was Mr. Nair's idea. He had
Mhm.
he told me that he wished to bring her memory alive. It's very much with him, and you must have read that she never lived to see him as a writer. So somewhere within
Yes.
him there must be the pain of her never having known.
Yes.
She thought he was scribbling things upstairs in the room of the house. Never realized that what he was going to write would was going to be a considerable body of work, and one that would touch the hearts of almost all of Kerala. That she never realized. She never knew. She never lived long enough for that. While he
Right.
was in college, where by then he might have published one or two stories, but even that she knew nothing about. So I think it came out of a sense of loss, probably,
Mhm.
uh, and the effort to bring her memory alive to everyone and to himself in the process. So that is why he compiled these series of articles and short stories, all of which touch in some way on the life he lived, within his family while she was still alive. So
Right.
that, I think, is the impulse behind the book.
Right.
So he
And
chose the pieces himself, and we did them.
right. So that sense of loss, actually, you rightly said, permeates this collection. And in the title collection, that's "Bear with Me, Amma," he writes about how what you just mentioned. In fact, that she couldn't live to see how he became. I wanted to ask you about let's go back to the beginning and the kind of social milieu he sort of grew up in, and that sort of also informed his writing in a sense. He began, of course, with poetry, but then quickly shifted to short stories and novels.
Yeah,
And
yeah. The short story is his most loved medium. He always says that. I think he enjoyed nothing so much as writing the short story, and he has written a lot.
how does his mother remain a kind of central presence,
Well,
if not
not
really?
in all the stories. That's why, this particular collection is culled from his memories of her. Not every. Many of his stories are, show the milieu of the life he lived in Kerala. That particular setup, which was around about the time when the matrilineal system of succession was slowly losing its hold, but had not fully lost its hold either. So, the younger generation was trying to make claims and trying to get out of the system, working their own solutions to try to get property for themselves and so on. So he grew up in that background. So both the old system and the beginnings of the new are very much alive. And I think that shows up very well in the stories. The declining process of the older system, the matrilineal system, and
Yes.
the beginnings of the beginnings of its decline, and the way claims were being made by the younger generation, how they were being accepted by an older generation or not accepted most of the time because they did not like it. But finally, the succession laws changed. So he grew up very much against that background.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's discuss a bit about the landscape of writing Malayalam literature at that point. I mean, of course, he is an iconic figure of the modern Malayalam literature. But at the time he began, and one of the things that strikes you is also the fact that he never sort of consciously took any side of any ideology. I mean,
No.
he broke his own path in that sense,
Yeah. Yeah.
and uh, uh, at that point of time, I think the prevalent literary that strand that was very very dominant at that point of time was social
Yeah.
realism. And he thought that he could do something different. And you know, if you could give us a sense of how his writing differed from the shape of Malayalam writing literature was at that point of time. I mean, of course, there were writers like Vakam Muhammad Bashir and and so many others, who wrote in the I think 50s and 60s, and then you had this figure who sort of comes and he writes in so many genres, short stories, of course, novels, and of course he'd go on to write so many screenplays and travelogues and literary works of literary criticism. But just a sense of the literary landscape of Malayalam literature at that point of time when he started writing.
I think it was the time when the short story was coming into prominence.
Right.
And a lot of short story writers, his contemporaries, who were breaking new ground, and writing from all parts of Kerala. But for him, the dominant landscape of his stories and of his thinking has always been his own village. If he went out of it, it was rarely. And, generally, as he himself has said, he liked to pick the characters he knew, the people in his own family, plus, all the local characters in that village of Kudallur. And he wrote about a kind of life, the way the warp and weft of that life was very much what he was living. He was not talking, about something that happened outside him. It's very much a part of him. And I think that's what shaped his writing. In all of this book, it's very clear. And in the majority of his writing, even in his novels. For instance, we have, he's written a novel on Bhima of the Mahabharata.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So when you break it down, that novel, again, you can read it as a family story. A mother and 5 sons and how they fought. It's so that family background, a family within a village, the problems they encounter, how they overcome them, or how they battle them. That is the fabric of his writing. And if he slips out of it, it's for a specific reason, because he wants to talk about something else that he experienced. But most, I think I would say about 90% of what he writes comes from his own experience, his own life, his own reaction to his childhood experiences and the experience of his youth, of growing up against that background of a swiftly changing Kerala.
Right. So while most of his writing, of course, draw on most of his writing draws on his experiences of growing up in that part of the country.
Yeah.
I think there are two particular examples that I wanted to ask, and I wanted to ask you what you make of it. Is that the novel Manju, which is set in, I think, Nainital, and
Manya, yeah.
yeah, and then you had I think, novel again on a novel called Varanasi, right?
Yeah, that was Varanasi was very late in his life.
Yes, yes.
Manya was a much earlier.
Mhm.
Although Manya is set, the setting is different.
Mhm.
I feel that the story itself contains, all the seeds of, what he has always written about. Have you read it?
No, I haven't, but yes, but I'm
Yeah,
familiar with.
yeah. It's set in a completely different place. It's very few of his short stories and novels are set outside Kerala. This is one of
Right.
the novels that is set completely outside, and it's um, it's a love story.
Mhm. Mhm.
So what happens in a love story like that is it could happen anywhere.
Yes,
That
yes.
he gave it the background of snow and the mountains is some. I've never asked him why he chose that particular, uh, that particular setting. I've never asked him that. I should at some point, I guess.
What is mind-boggling is it's just how prolific he has been, in the sense that, whatever, I mean,
Absolutely.
especially, short stories. If he writes,
Yeah.
about 20 odd collections of short stories, and then goes on to write about over perhaps over 50 screenplays, I think one of the
Yeah,
few Indian
58
who has written
screenplays.
so
Yeah,
many screenplays. Yeah.
yeah,
What do you think is the secret of this output? And I think I was reading one of the pieces in this collection, which is called, the title is "A Story Is Born," and his sort of this conflict that goes on in his mind before writing,
yeah,
in which he's
yeah,
talking about his creative process, that how tough it is for him to write,
yeah.
and I think yet another essay he's writing, how how his tone between the need for solitude, and again, and this yearning for company, to have people around also, and
Yeah,
this need to sort of.
the contradictions that he's always facing. He wants one thing, but when he gets it, he doesn't want it anymore. He wants another thing. That's what comes out in that particular article. He wants solitude, but when he has the solitude, he can't work.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that, I think that he has thought a lot about the process of writing. And
Mhm.
in a way, his thought processes have tortured him, tormented him a little, and it's also it's touched me very deeply that in two or three of those essays he said that he is never satisfied until he gets what he thinks is the right word, the right sentence, which seems to come like magic suddenly. And so it's a struggle, and he confesses to that struggle in many of those early articles, right?
He also wrote, yeah, no, he also wrote those two books on craft, and if you could tell us a little bit about, what does he write about in those two books?
In the craft books, I'm afraid I have not read them with great attention because I've never had occasion to translate them. I've just gone through them in order to get a sense of what he writes. Again, he
Mhm.
does write about the struggle of writing, and how it's never been easy for him, and he doesn't think that writing is easy. You know, after having written so much and so prolifically, he doesn't feel that it all came easily. Even now, he thinks
Mhm.
that he feels that there's always a struggle involved, and that the crafting is endless. It never stops. There's never a moment when he can say, I have learned this. That's what I felt about what he says on his craft.
So, we were talking about the matrilineal family structure of Kerala that informs
Yeah,
much of his writing. And in this context, I wanted to ask you about, some of his early novels, beginning with Nalukettu, which was his, his breakout novel in that sense. And yeah. And then there was Asuravitu, there was Kalam. If you could talk a little bit about, a little about these early novels.
Yeah. Nalikattu is very much on the the materialist system and how vicious it could be, how harsh it could be.
Yes.
The structure is very complicated and very difficult to explain to non-Nayars, because it's the succession is in the female line.
Yes.
True.
Yes.
And the property goes from mother to daughter.
I'm familiar with that. The Nair kind.
But very often it is the mother's brother who rules the household. So you see that even in the story in this collection, what is it called? A Birthday Remembered.
Yes.
It's the man who holds the key to the granary, and the widowed sister has to ask him for the rice she cooks every day. So you see, there are fallacies in that system that it's not easy to explain to other people. That what the system did provide was, it always provided shelter, a refuge to the woman. Unlike in other communities, a widow was not thrown out. She could always return to the matrilineal household. She had a place there. She had food and shelter, quote unquote. But it depended on who was ruling that household. If it was a strong woman, she could manage to, look after her sisters, her nieces, everything. If it was a strong man who was doing the work of the household, going to the fields, gathering in the harvests, storing the grain, and he held the, proverbially and otherwise the keys to the granary, he could bully everybody. He was the Karanavar, the senior male member of the household, and you see that happening in Nalikattu, which is why the boy nurses a deep grudge against the old man, and finally has his revenge as the system changes and he is able to buy back the house that he was expelled from. So that's why it has that name. Nalikattu is the central, the name of the architectural name of the Nair household. And Nala is 4, Katta are pillars. So like in most Indian architecture, household architecture, there's a central courtyard open to the sky with 4 pillars at each corner. So that is the Nalikattu, and that lies in the heart of the house. And so the whole house is given the name of that courtyard, the Nalikattu. That's why it's called that house.
So, have you had a chance to? I mean, of course, he has written about it in his memoirs and elsewhere. But if you had a chance to talk about, how he sort of, considering he was a science graduate, he had a degree in chemistry, then he started teaching mathematics.
Well, he that degree only because he thought he could get. They told him that that's the only way he could make money.
Yes.
Yeah, the only reason.
Yeah, and also this he of course refers to those days in some of these pieces, that how hard things were at some point, and because and his father was in Ceylon, and then so those days. Do you sense the influence of these days also in his writing, and mostly about it in fiction? In short stories.
Yes, especially the difficulty to have spending money as a child and as a young man growing up. He had to miss a whole year because they couldn't afford to send 2 of the boys to college, so he had to stay back while his brother went. But he says that year made his life. That was the year he read and read and read. Fortunately, because he found this treasure house of a library in a neighbor's house. And I think that was the year he read the most. And it was his introduction to, international literature in a way, because he read a lot of both English and Malayalam there. They had all kinds of books. But that year was actually a year when he couldn't go to college at all. So yes, that recurs in many stories. Even if when he's talking of family life, when he writes a family story, the question of financial difficulty, of difficulty for food, that it recurs very often. So obviously these are images that stayed with him from his childhood.
Right, right. Coming back to the book, Gita, I was just curious to know a little bit about this process of translation for you, and what it meant, in the sense that was translating the memoirs more easy than short stories, in the sense that when you're translating a story, you have to be attuned to every word, that you have to get every word right, so that that texture remains the same and that connotation also remains the same. How did that work for you, the process of
The
translation?
translation has never been easy. Everything has been a challenge, because each, a story, an article, a milieu, a particular, event, each has its own challenge. And I've always considered it a challenge. And, I've never been satisfied with what I did. Never felt that, I have really caught it after. So I started translating in the 90s, actually. So at the
Yeah.
time, there was hardly any translation being done.
Mm.
But in these 30 years, I'm not sure, I feel even now that I've learned a lot,
Right.
and I keep learning, but I have never felt that, I have done a piece with which I'm really satisfied.
Right, right. But now, today we have a much more vibrant scene, and even as we are
We have
talking,
a very vibrant scene, because suddenly, India has woken up to the fact that, there are so many languages, so much to read, and, we need translators to put those literatures before us. There's no other way.
mm,
So I think we must be there are many other countries I know, but in India, the challenge is very great, with the multiplicity of languages, and especially some languages which are which hardly which some don't have a script, some do, are not that developed. So the challenges are much higher, I feel, than in any other country in the world. But now there is a reading public for that. And fortunately, publishers have become more interested than when we started in the early days.
right.
And, publishers were not interested at all in what we were doing.
Mm, mm. We just had a collection of Malayalam short stories. It's called The Greatest Malayalam Stories Ever Told, by
With
A.J.
age
Thomas.
advances, yeah.
Selected, yeah. So I think Mr. Nair's story is also one of them. And
Yeah.
I happened to meet and just say hello. In fact, I wanted to have a long conversation, but that was not the right time, because we met at a festival. Paul Zacharia. And he was
Oh,
gracious, he was kind. So I'm saying you have translated his work, and I just wanted to understand if in the context of one question that Mr. MT Vasudevan Nair, of course, has had a huge presence when it comes to Malayalam literature in these past many decades.
yeah.
But I also wanted to ask you about from here onwards, what does the shape of Malayalam fiction writing look to you? And I'm talking about both short stories and novels. And you can, of course, talk about all the other writers that you have translated, including Mr. Paul Zakaria.
Yes, I've always felt that it's a very lively scene in Kerala. Perhaps, Bengal and Kerala share that, they're uh, there are endless writers in every kind of literature, in poetry and fiction and non-fiction and screenwriting. And Kerala has only grown livelier with the years. Now, there's a whole generation of young writers whom I haven't even had time to look at to read. Growing up now, whose names I know, but I've not had the time to even read their work. It's very vibrant, very challenging. So, if what you are asking is, translation, every writer offers a very different kind of challenge. Paul Zacharia, for instance, is difficult in a very different way. The way he uses language, the way he develops his fiction. It's very challenging, and you have to work hard at it. You have to work hard at every writer, but some writers more than others. Anand, for instance, is a writer whose prose is very dense. He has often a sentence one sentence that will go over a whole paragraph, and you have to work indescribably hard at elucidating that, sometimes breaking it up, sometimes I must say that I've been very fortunate in always having had help from the writers. I've always requested help, and no writer has ever withheld trying to help me, explaining. Sometimes you need to interact with them before you really can arrive at a final effort at having translated what they said. And I have been very fortunate in having very, very cooperative authors.
Yeah.
All of them, Vasudevan Nair, Anand, Zacharia, Mukundan, Lalithambika, she had died by the time I started to handle her work. But again, the family was very helpful. And, in Lalithambika's work, the challenge is always that she uses a kind of language which nobody speaks anymore. The Nambudiri language, it uses idioms and phrases and words that are almost obsolete now. So it was very difficult to find exact equivalents, exact explanations of rituals which are no longer in force, which are not carried out. Even, a way of life, like, when she speaks of a way of life of, say, in the family, there is a ritual going on in one part of the house. Children are playing games in the other part of the house. I found it very difficult to find anybody who remembered the kind of games those children were playing and which were described in the story, because those games don't exist anymore. So, there are these little things that sometimes hold you up. And you can't find people to elucidate them. So in her case, in Anterjanam's case, that was my greatest stumbling block, that I couldn't find somebody to explain to me. And if I did, it would be somebody in the older generation who neither had the patience or sometimes, just couldn't explain in the way that, in a way that I could understand.
Yes.
And the challenges are very different with each writer. And sometimes it's challenge of language, sometimes challenge of familiar, sometimes it's a challenge in historical challenge.
Yes. But we're all, and especially these non-language readers, I mean, those of us in the north who have not had the privilege to know the language and and its nuances, are grateful
And
to.
language changes as we grow up. Language changes, and sometimes what the kind of idioms your grandfather chose, used, may not be comprehensible to you now.
Absolutely.
Just as I now don't understand what my grandchildren say sometimes. My grandchildren are in the United States, and when they talk English, I don't understand because I don't use those idioms.
True. Every generation somehow, uh, molds the language in their way, in that sense.
Yeah. So working with different kinds of people who set their novels at different moments in history. in different parts of, even in a region like a small state like Kerala, language differs from region to region, from community to community, as you know.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Talking of Lalithambika, you were talking about him, and I go back to this piece by Mr. Nair and his in which he pays the tribute, and that's the title essay, which is "Bear with Me, Amma," and he writes that his own mother never wrote a letter to him, but Lalithambika wrote a very affectionate letter in which
Saying,
was
my dear
also
son. Yeah.
yes, my dear son, and that's very poignant. I found because, and then he goes to talk about a little bit of debt that he owes as a writer to her, and I'm
Yes.
sure many more Malayalam writers later, would
Yeah.
have, bore the same sense of gratitude in that sense.
Yeah.
So talk about her a bit, her writing, her sort of, and how that sort of shaped, the writers after her,
Well,
and
he had
especially.
a very important role to play when he edited the Madhubhumi in Calicut as a young man, because he was the person who actually found many writers. They would the stories would flow endlessly into the Madhubhumi office, and it would be he who selected and used them for the Madhubhumi magazine. And a lot of the writers who became very eminent later first figured in that magazine. Lalithambika was one of them.
Right. Okay. Okay.
And her only novel, Agnisakshi, was serialized by him in the Madhubhumi. I
Right.
read it as a very young woman. It had just come out as a serial. And I didn't realize all this until he told me later. He said, that she sent me, it was I who published it for her in the beginning and then later as a book. And many writers in Kerala, used to serialize their work, send short stories as well as serialize their novels in the Madhubhumi while he was the editor.
Okay.
So a lot of the younger editors at that time owe their, first publications to him.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, Thank you so much. It was great talking to you. I wanted to tell you that the role of a translator and how that's important in when it comes to readers reading books written in other languages of India. So, and especially those who are used to reading English language books, and then there are so many wonderful uh, books written in other languages that need to be explored, that need to be read. And it is here that a fine translator like you, we owe a great deal of debt to you, because you do not just translate, you also in some sense transcreate, and every great work of translation is also a work of transcreation. So thank you so much.
Thank
And
you. And I have one question for you before you end. Which language do you translate from? Because I see that you're a translator.
I write in Urdu, English, Hindi. So these three languages usually I translate into each other basically. So
And
of
have you
late
done a novel or have you done fiction?
I have not done fiction. I've mostly done poetry. So
Oh,
so I'm,
I will
yeah.
look out for that and read it. Thank you.
Subscribe to the Federal's YouTube page for more news and updates.